Spinning. Hey, we're live. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the channel of Sleepy Reader, aka Damien. And I'm joined by good old Matt. He's not Agent 42Q anymore. He's not even Wednesday Serial anymore. He's just Matt.
I got found out.
Star of the
It's Untold.
Untold Tales of Spider-Man. No.
Talks.
Untold Talks. I don't know why I can never get my mind wrapped around that. And we are recording for video while we actually record an audio podcast, but we'll have some pictures people can look at who want to watch it on video. So maybe that'll be fun. And I'm drinking very macho green tea.
Alrighty.
I was going to go for alcohol, but I decided I need caffeine of some sort.
Well, you can get that caffeinated beer.
Caffeinated beer? I haven't tried that yet.
Oh, yeah. It's like coffee beer.
Then you're wide awake drunk.
Yeah. It's
perfect.
The worst.
Maybe it gives you an interesting hangover.
It does at that.
So will you be doing a video on Wolverine soon?
I've procured some Wolverine, but I have been getting a lot of comics, but I'm still digging through Green Lantern primarily. But I am very interested to get into some X-Men. I've been following this account that's also some YouTube videos called the Claremont Run, which is about a Canadian-funded study of the Claremont Run. And
wow. Those Canadians, they always fund good things.
Yeah, I should move up there and do the slot run or something, right?
You could call it In the Slot.
Yeah.
Something like that. But you did mention to me just before we came live that did you buy all 189 issues of Wolverine Volume 2?
Potentials to I'm trying to procure the run, but it's not as cheap as I'd like. So I'm trying to angle that down. But I've made some dents in my X-Men collection. I got Uncanny from like from like 130 or so pretty much through, with a few notable holes. Like I don't have a proper first appearance of Gambit, and there's a handful of issues, but once you hit like, except for that like Gambit up, like volumes 2 and 3 and 4 all the way through.
Well, I have very fond memories of the Larry Hama, Mark Silvestri part of Wolverine, but once you hit that someday, you can tell me if it's maybe worth talking about or something.
I have no idea when or how that will be. I've been more about collecting than reading in any amount of kind lately. So,
well, then that's more like me. I have been gathering up more and more of a hoard, reading very little. But I did read these 5 issues of Spider-Man.
Right.
So that's good. It took me a long while, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I am like the worst podcast partner.
Well, it'll be curious to see what you think about it. Should we kind of start?
Yeah. So now we'll start as if we're just recording the podcast. Matt will do the intro.
All right.
When he's ready.
Hello, ladies and germs, and welcome to another scintillating episode of Never Stay Dead. I'm clearly the top host, Matt, here with my co-host,
Damien, and I am so glad we're being scintillated once again.
Yeah. This time we are discussing the launch of J. Micheal Straczynski's run on The Amazing Spider-Man, which transpired during Volume 2 of the run, issues 30 through 35. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
That's off raw memory. All right. Yes.
And does this story arc have a name? I guess I didn't notice.
The trade is called Coming Home.
Coming Home. Okay. Which doesn't tell you anything about what the story's about then.
Right. And you have no history with this.
This particular era of Spider-Man, no. I think I read one issue of the Straczynski Romita Jr. run. And I remember liking the art a lot and thinking, oh, I should get more of these comics. But that was during my period of not paying very close attention, especially to Marvel and DC.
Okay.
I think this 2001.
Yes, this is 2001. And so just to talk around this a little bit, I got this run as a way to kind of catch up because I had subscribed to Spider-Man for the first time to like get in the mail from Marvel, though technically.
So what year was that you were subscribing to Marvel?
2001.
2001. Okay.
So I got the issue that follows exactly after this trade, which is the somewhat infamous 9/11 issue.
Yeah, that's a weird issue for you to start your subscription on.
I thought something was wrong because I get this thing, and keep in mind the subscriptions come out months after sometimes everything, and with everything, it was in this case.
Yeah, subscriptions, copies, at least in my memory when I was a kid, always came very late.
And I was looking forward to my first issue of Spider-Man, and I get this black cover. And I'm looking at it like, did I get a misprint? Did something happen? And no, it's this whole thing about 9/11. It's been a few months since 9/11 transpired, and I had no idea this was coming, and that really hit me. So that was something. But I ended up getting the trade to read up beforehand, which was very helpful, for the stuff that followed and whatnot. And I've read this trade more times than I've read pretty much any other comic. There's a few exceptions, but it's something.
So you read this trade pretty early in your Spider-Man reading career.
Oh, relative, yeah.
And well, so what year did you start? What your first Spider-Man was before all this, I suppose. This was when you decided to subscribe to Spider-Man.
Right. So, I mean, I'd been picking up random issues of Spider-Man and trying to pick up stories that I could that Wizard had deemed more noteworthy.
Okay.
I had this magazine that was like a Spider-Man special, and they had like the 50 best Spider-Man stories, and a lot of them were ones I could try to get in trade, or I actually went back and picked up the Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut relatively cheap before that all exploded. And
is the Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, is that the earlier JR
run? That's
or is that another?
That's a Stern run. I do not recall who did the art.
I think when Roger Stern did that Juggernaut story, I didn't know what it was called. I remember reading it when it came out. That was back when I still read Spider-Man.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was JR doing the art then, but his art was entirely different than it is now. Perhaps we haven't mentioned yet that this is Micheal Straczynski, J. Micheal Straczynski, and John Romita Jr.
And Scott Hanna.
And Scott Hanna, who does a very good job on the inking, I think.
Yeah.
So, and this is like the new JR when he's not at all like his father and is something completely different. But become himself, I guess, as we now know him.
What's interesting to me now is I've gone back and read prior to this, and JR is on the book for a good chunk before this with Jenkins writing. And he's doing the same art. Same
style. So he's had this style for a while.
Yeah, the art team was here, and they changed writers because J. Micheal Straczynski was this big get. So you can actually tell, because the arc that precedes this, there's 2 issues in Amazing, and then it goes to Peter Parker Spider-Man, which was the sister book at the time, and then like an annual. And they they crammed it, like something happened there. Like they were getting this in front of people as fast as they could. So this is one of those weird moments where they have a celebrity to write and they're making a big deal about it.
So do you know J. Micheal Straczynski's, because I don't know his history in comics. Was this very early in his comic book writing? Because for a while he was writing a lot of comics for Marvel and DC.
Unlike other celebrities coming in, I mean, this is post Babylon 5,
right?
Which had some comic tie-ins. I don't know if he was really involved with that, but I'm sure.
Yeah. For those who are not science fiction nerds, J. Micheal Straczynski was the creator, producer, main writer of the 5 seasons of Babylon 5, which was a huge sort of cult science fiction hit.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
He also was involved in various other shows. The one I know, he was involved in some revival of the Twilight Zone, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he had a lot of Hollywood credentials as a writer and producer.
And in comics, he had done things like Rising Stars by this point, and Midnight Suns. And so, and I believe a couple other smaller projects. And so he's gone through his paces with comics as well. Like at that point, if you had those kinds of hits, I don't know if Marvel would normally put you up for Spider-Man, but I think Marvel would be looking at you potentially as a writer with that kind of successful, especially because keep in mind, this is before like Image is the way it is now. Like having those successful like third-party comics and having a body of that kind of work that would be sold at comic shops at that point, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. I have to say I would not, because I associated him with science fiction and fantasy, I wouldn't have immediately thought of Spider-Man for him. So when I first heard he was on Spider-Man, I was a little surprised. But he seems to have a real love for Spider-Man, I would guess, from what I've seen here.
Yeah, he does, and I think this is one of the most celebrated Spider-Man runs of all time, and that celebration stops immediately as J.R. leaves the book and then becomes some of the most controversial books.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah, One More Day, the other, the Civil War bit. There's a lot of interesting stuff that J. Micheal Straczynski's spoken out against, and how much of it's editorial, and
right.
It's an interesting, but this is a beloved story.
Well, then I'm glad you've got me to read it. You want to do your quick summary of the basics of the story before we discuss it in depth?
Yeah, so Spider-Man is kind of churning a new leaf. Mary Jane has just reappeared from being kidnapped, presumed dead for a while. Another story. And he's feeling a new lease on life. Along with that, he's taking on a new job, and he's trying out becoming a school teacher back at the school where he used to get beat up by Flash and all that, back to the roots. Meanwhile, there's this mysterious new figure, Ezekiel, who is questioning things about his Spider-Man-ness that he's never really thought about before.
And surprisingly, Ezekiel seems to have similar powers.
Yes. And keep in mind, this is before Miles, this is before Spider-Verse or anything.
Right.
Yet someone coming up with spider powers is pretty cool. The only other person...
And Ezekiel's about my age. I mean, he's been around a long time with these powers not revealed to the world.
Yeah. And... but he warns Peter that this entity is hunting him and that it's going to be the fight of his life to survive. And there you go. I mean, I think that's the best way to sum it up. Is that good?
Oh, you want to just sum up the first issue or sort of the...
Well, that's more than the first issue. I mean, that's more or less the arc, not summing up the conclusion.
But this entity is like a vampire, energy vampire who only goes after superheroes, and particularly ones that are totemic of animals, I guess.
Right, which is different from where they rewrite it with Spider-Verse later, which more people might be familiar with if they're listening to him. At this point, totemic powers. And yeah, do you want to back up and maybe talk more in detail about some of the?
Well, sorry, I'm being pushy, but I want the summary to go a little further. The vampiric guy, what's his name? Morbius?
No, that's a different vampire.
Mobius. He's Mobius. He has a servant.
Yeah.
And what is his name?
Barely matters.
But you said it a moment ago, but I spoke over you.
No, Morlun is
Morlun, yeah.
Is the vampire's name. Well,
yeah.
Vampire-esque character, yeah.
And well, maybe we shouldn't spoil the end yet, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on. Because the other thing, or maybe you mentioned it and I spaced it out, is that Peter Parker decides to become a teacher at his old school, which has become kind of the cliche of the bad inner city school that where no one cares and there's no real learning going on.
I mean, sort of thing. It's right in the middle of Queens. I don't know if that's. I mean, it is definitely a trope. It is that sort of thing, but I mean, it feels about right here.
Yeah, I don't know. I did student teach at some elementary schools that were in low income areas, but they weren't in New York City. But they weren't as rough as what he portrays there.
Yeah. And that's a whole issue that we can get into.
Right. And I only dealt with elementary school. Yeah. For me, I just constantly was loving the artwork. Even though I know Straczynski's the superstar, for me personally, JR was the superstar here.
JR is my favorite Spider-Man artist. So,
and at some point in the 2000s, he was considered the top artist at Marvel. I don't know if he already was, or this is what built his reputation.
I mean, I think being on this book catapulted him to the very tip top. It's just, it doesn't stand out the way like Jim Lee was on X-Men or anything, right?
Well, no, not that big, but this was at a time when comics were not selling in large numbers and stuff, so you couldn't have that Jim Lee kind of effect.
We're starting to see the bump for movies, though. Like this was around the era of the new X-Men that Grant Morrison did. So.
But this was the period where Marvel was trying to pull itself out of the hole by getting these celebrity writers to come to them.
Yeah. Yeah,
and I guess it worked. I mean, it did pull Marvel out of the hole.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the financial thing, that had more to do with the stuff outside of comics. But I mean, as far as creatively,
right.
I mean, there had to be something here because good comics and these things did sell. I actually think the move to trades was a big part of what made a lot of the money for them too, because this is the era that they really started collecting everything in trades.
Probably, yeah, the beginning of trades becoming a regular part of reading.
This
was certainly an era where I started to move to trades.
And this is like a step right after Ultimate started. So this was a time when Amazing Spider-Man was allowed to almost be a little more adult because they had teen Peter Parker, in the other universe.
Right.
Wow. So
what do you think about Ezekiel? This, well, he's not a billionaire, but is extremely rich guy who has powers like Spider-Man.
Isn't he a billion? I mean, he's filthy rich.
It's like $500 million or something. They actually state the number at some point. In 2001, there weren't many, if any, billionaires yet.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think he's a very compelling character. I like him a lot more than what they do with other Spider characters later. Because, I mean, think about it. Like, we only have 5 issues in this trade, but by the end of it, like, I feel like he's a consequential part of the fabric of everything. The one thing that weirds me out is he speaks a lot to the spiritual side of Spider-Man, and the question he poses by the end of this first issue is basically the idea of, are your powers mystic? And Spider-Man's like, no, it was a radiated Spider-Man bit me. And he basically is saying, well, was it a spider meant to give you these powers and the radiation happened to kill it? Or was it the radiation that enabled it to give you the powers?
Right.
Which kind of has a potential to make Spider-Man a more mystic character. And it's
a very good question. I mean, we never question the old Stan Lee trope of you get something radioactive happens to you and then you get powers.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I mean, not to spoil anything, it kind of almost doesn't matter either way, though.
Right.
And it was crazy because I've had this trade for years, but recently in my quest to collect everything Spider-Man, or at least mainstream, I got the actual issues for this, and I was looking through the you write in
the letter page.
I don't know why I could.
It's late at night, folks. For those listening to this later, it's past midnight Matt's time.
So people were floored by this question. They just basically every letter they printed was about like people trying to grapple and deal with this question, which is interesting. I've never seen a letter page that had that kind of uniform of response to basically a line in a comic.
Well, because people had for years just sort of accepted to so suddenly have that whole ordering of the meaning of his powers, even though, as you say, it doesn't really matter. He has the powers one way or another, but the whole meaning of his powers sort of be shifted in a completely different direction that none of us ever thought about, but it was sitting there right in front of us the whole time.
And it's fun. It's clever. What's really cool about it is I've heard a lot of people speak to it as a retcon. And it's not a retcon. It's just a really fun reframing. It doesn't change a lick of anything that came before it.
Yeah. But it gives Peter Parker a new way to sort of have some depth and stuff to think about.
Well, yeah, and as this run continues, we play with more Mystic, which means a lot of Doctor Strange appearances, which is cool.
I didn't know that. More Doctor Strange in future issues beyond this arc. I can't resist but ask, I assume Ezekiel returns at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What concerned me about Ezekiel is when he first shows up, he's like the spiritual guru, it seems, but then he turns out to be, by the end of the story, I mean, it was a very interesting twist. He's basically inferior to Spider-Man because he did not make good use of his powers, even though he comes off as the wise person who knows all about the powers better than Parker does.
Well,
and he kind of seems to want to be more like Spider-Man now that he's met Peter.
Well, so there's a few factors at play there, right? So I feel like this comes up more later in the story, though.
Right, I'm jumping around. I'm sorry. I'm focusing on the character rather than the story.
Yeah, that's fine. So Ezekiel does eventually be shown to be less powerful than Peter, but that's more into how he gets his powers, which is interesting because we as readers are given insight into that, whereas Peter isn't in this story, where basically Ezekiel goes to an Aztec tomb and goes through some blood ritual in order to gain the powers through the Asani.
Right.
Things.
Yeah, my focus wasn't just on the fact that he was less powerful.
Right.
But also on the fact that he was less, in a sense, he's less morally and spiritually advanced than Peter Parker.
Yeah, he's not a hero. He's
not a hero. He's not someone who takes on responsibility.
He was a billionaire seeking power.
Right. He mentions he pays his employees well and stuff like that. So he's a benevolent multimillionaire, but he's not really making any personal sacrifices.
Right. And I think it's interesting because you see this route of someone who's doing swell but not giving up. But I mean, Peter is... Peter is selfless. I mean, at times
Right.
functionally retarded with money, which bothers me, but that's not really here. And at this point too, like I think it's no mistake that Peter's making himself a teacher to make it so that even his profession is more
Right. A
noble.
teacher in a school that most teachers don't want to work in.
Right. And so we're now looking at, we were.
Oh, sorry. I'll go back to that.
Speaking of the teacher bit, the issue where Peter actually becomes a teacher, which is something, there's a beat that happens in the first issue with Aunt May and Peter, where Aunt May mentions that like the school's looking for teachers and that he should consider being a substitute, basically. And there's this beat there with Peter spacing out and then kind of tuning back in, and Aunt May kind of repeating what she's saying, but slightly different. And
was that the first issue?
I'm pretty sure it is, but what's in what issue might not be.
It's hard to know, actually. It's all, even though I've just read it last night, I can't remember. There it is. It's the beginning of issue 31.
Yeah. It's just this beat with the idea of Peter being kind of a space cadet half the time, which makes so much sense for the character, but it's never really been portrayed before, but it fits. And we also get this little bit of, as much as I love how J. Micheal Straczynski writes Peter and all the other characters, he's even stated in his interview, his favorite characters to write were Mary Jane and Aunt May.
Huh.
And his Aunt May is a character I wish more people would push to emulate further, because she's shrewd, she's insightful, she pushes Peter in different ways, and she has a lot of cool little things to say. And
she's not the Aunt May from the Spider-Mans I used to read.
Yeah, no, she's not the Stan Lee. She's kind of Aunt May. She's a much more shrewd character, and I think it makes for such a better book. I don't know. What did you think of Aunt May here? Because you are used to more of the doddering old maid.
Yeah, the Aunt May was a big shock for me. I mean, you're right in your analysis of her, but I kind of am so used to her being the comic clueless character.
Right.
Who's, a view of old age as being just a total befuddlement.
Though you're getting a hell of a culture shock with this Aunt May, because I mean, at this point, Aunt May had her, she'd been part of rent strikes. She had done all these other things in other earlier runs. So like, this is less of a leap than that, but this is the most competent the character's been.
Yeah, I mean, so she does seem to add some wisdom to Peter's life and everything. So that is cool. It took me by surprise because I was not prepared for it. But as you talk about it, as I think back on it, she played a good role. And it makes sense. Peter Parker's somewhat of a genius. You wouldn't think his aunt is an idiot.
Right.
But I'm just so used to that. I mean, it was just the Stan Lee sense of humor. And also, I think originally when comics were aimed at kids, or they thought they were aimed at kids, they kind of wanted to make fun of the adult characters in people's lives. So it's the adults in his life were J. Jonah Jameson and his befuddled Aunt May and that sort of thing.
And between this Aunt May and this Ezekiel kind of mystic character, I'm almost surprised Madam Web doesn't come up.
Did she appear later in Straczynski's?
Now that I'm saying it, I can't recall. It's been years since I read most of the runs, so I don't believe so. But she does show up later. Yeah, she's a weird character. Yeah, so I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about here. I'm going to let you go for a while.
Oh. Well, no. So I was focused on Ezekiel. I keep forgetting his name. Not Morbius. Moreland.
Moreland.
The interest. Moreland seemed like he could have been more developed. It was interesting that he had his kind of Renfield character. I think that was the name of the human that Dracula used as a slave. And there was interesting hints about that, and it kind of played a bit towards the end. So I liked Moreland as a villain. There was a moment where he punches Spider-Man, and Spider-Man says he is stronger than the Hulk, and that kind of threw me off a bit.
Well, and what I wonder about with that isn't necessarily that he's actually, like, if he was to punch just like a brick wall, he'd be stronger than the Hulk. But I feel like he's able to do more damage because effectively when he's punching Spider-Man, he's grabbing his strength as well.
Right.
And so like it's going to hurt him in a very unique way. Oh my god, I love that page too, where he effectively activates his spider sense in a way that makes him scurry away like a spider.
Right. So there's this scene, for those who can't see it, that when Spider-Man first swings by near Moreland, his spider sense goes off in such an extreme way that he just has a primordial urge to go hide and scurry away. Like the spider has sensed its predator that it can't defeat. And that gives a lot of weight to the idea of the spider, what did they call it? Totem or whatever that powers him. And the idea that, so the whole existence of Moreland kind of proves what Ezekiel's saying. So it also leaves one with a feeling that you want Ezekiel to come back to help Spider-Man explore the true nature of his power. So it is a little bit of a retcon, you know, it's kind of, doesn't really change anything, but it does change what you might think of Spider-Man. Like it puts him on a more spiritual level in terms of his powers,
a more mystical level. Yeah.
Which could be irritating. I mean, sometimes you like the fact that they're based in pseudo science fiction rather than mysticism.
You know, I think, I mean, I've heard of parts where they try to like rework the powers or do something like that. Like recently, Dan Slott's gone back and kind of done a reworking of the Fantastic Four and how they got their powers and whatnot. And there's universally been a pretty violent reaction against that story.
Right.
But I've heard a lot of opinions about this, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention anything negative about this. And I think it's not just that it's opening mystic doors, but it's the way the story portrays it. Like it's so keen because it doesn't betray anything before this.
Right.
It just opens doors moving forward with a new realization.
Yeah. No, it is kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
So, and there's scenes, you know, there's the scene where he's teaching at school and one of the kids becomes one of those shooters who wants to get revenge on everybody at school. And that left a bad taste in my mouth for some reason. I can't quite say why, but
well, what's hard about that issue is that it's tackling school shootings, which, keep in mind, this is just months before 9/11. So that was the hottest issue of the day.
Right.
And it's kind of a B story in that issue because they're dealing so much with the mystery of Ezekiel and whatnot. The school shooting just kind of takes place in a few pages, and Spider-Man asks this kid to help him out with some smoke. And then when he's tackling the school shooter, like you're on the page now, it looks so heroic. It's so colorful and whatnot. Yeah. And then if you go to the next page, he's like holding a kid ready for a beatdown. And there's a weird dissonance between the art and the story there that I think it's uncomfortable for a reason, or it's uncomfortable to pretty much everyone who reads it, I believe.
Yeah. And I don't know, the issue of someone who is so bullied at school that they basically go insane and decide to kill everybody. That is really a huge story in a way. And it kind of is weird to have it in the middle of this other story. And then we just move on. it's kind of, again, maybe that's why I pushed back against the trope of this incredibly tough high school kind of inner city high school kind of trope.
If anything, the story's a stumble. It's that, especially when they play it for laughs as the science teacher's just leaving.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I quit. That's it. I've had it with this place. But yeah, I guess that just left me that distracted me and it depressed me. And so anyway, it was just kind of a weird thing because I think overall Straczynski's doing a good job of making a big kind of mythic story about heroism and stuff. But this part of it leaves us a little empty. It kind of reminds me of the fact that lately I've been less excited to read superhero stories because they're stories about people who beat people up in the name of justice. And given what we've seen of, a lot of police behavior lately, the use of violence as a way to right wrongs seems rather disheartening at the moment.
I've had to think about that a lot recently, especially because I've been reading in particular Green Lantern, which is space cops.
Right.
And I know I'm coming up. It's going to take me a little bit to get there, but John's run, there's a point where they allow the use of lethal force. It's kind of this, like yeehaw moment in the book, and I'm like, right. That's not going to read well right now.
Yeah.
So, and with stuff around like John's and all that being wrapped up in all this hoopla around Joss Whedon being a less than stellar guy, I don't know. There's a lot of negativity and hard to take right now. So, yeah.
Right. So when they bring real world stuff into comics, it just emphasizes to me right now that the real world is different than the world of superheroes. It almost seems like if you imbibe superheroes in the wrong way, you become one of those bad cops if you're not.
Well,
anyway, I don't want to go on about that, but it's keyed in for me during this part.
Well, just to go a little further with it, I mean, there's been that whole discussion that Jerry Conway's been raising because a lot of cops have taken to using the Punisher logo in a way that he finds disturbing, a lot of others have. And there's been pushback on that in particular. And I think it's something we kind of need to think about. Like, I'm really curious what Grant Morrison's going to do with Green Lantern coming back. I'm really curious what Nick Spencer is going to do with Spider-Man once he reveals who Kindred is and actually has to write a story in the moment. I'm really curious to see how it goes, because I feel like once things, once we get past the stories that were effectively just kind of held back because of COVID, I feel like there's going to be a shift in superhero storytelling overall to address this kind of new light that's been put on law enforcement, all that with violence. I think there's something there.
Well, a while back we read the early Frank Miller Daredevil, and there's an ongoing thing in that where whenever he needs some information, he just goes to this bar where criminals hang out and just beats everyone up. And that, if you were to take that seriously and apply it to real life, you end up in a very bad place.
Right.
Look at these suspicious looking people. Let's beat them up, and then we'll find out. We'll stir up the rats, and the criminals will come out, and we'll solve the crime that way.
But
it doesn't work out very well in real life.
Speaking of Frank Miller, I started reading Martha Washington, and there's a lot of stuff in there to her situation that feels more present. I'm actually wondering if that book's going to kind of get a new light, put on it, because there's an African-American character to cling on to, though written by two super white guys. But there's a lot of stuff in that book that is ringing right now in an interesting way. Plus, I mean, it's the guy who drew Watchmen, and there's some moments in there that keys to that kind of level of craft. And
right.
I don't know.
Well, and I actually just was listening to an interview with Dave Gibbons, who was the artist on Martha Washington, and he said, at the time that he and Frank Miller teamed up, they were both superstars and they could write their ticket anywhere. And Dark Horse was willing to lose money just to have them do their comic at Dark Horse. They ended up deciding to cut Dark Horse in a little bit, but so anyway, it made me want to go back and look at Martha Washington. I only read little bits of it back in the 90s, and it's kind of vague in my mind now. But I do have a lot of issues of it that I've collected over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's only like a dozen, I think.
Well, there were a couple of Martha Washington series, so I have.
Right, but they're only like 5 issues a pop.
Oh, okay.
So.
Okay, so I'm just unclear.
There's 2 5 issues, then like
the lay of the land there.
Other smaller things, but yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to have Peter Parker go back to high school as a teacher. So if they explore that further in this Straczynski run, that gives me another reason to keep reading this run after we talk about these first 5 issues.
And I will say that there are a lot of issues that follow this that deal with the kids in the city and make them a part of the story in a way that actually feels very resonant and really good. There's one issue in particular that we covered on the other podcast, Vibes, that's always stuck out to me. And I just feel it was a cool angle to go with. There is a kind of tragedy in losing the Bugle office and not getting your JJJ and all that.
Yes.
But
there's something comforting about the JJJ stuff.
But it's funny, after this, I mean, we don't really go back to Peter just being in his normal Daily Bugle job. I mean, he's worked at the Daily Bugle since, but it's in a different capacity. And so, I mean, this really kind of broke a mold for Spider-Man that he's never returned from.
Yeah, so I mean, beyond that, it's kind of a simple plot.
Yeah.
Ezekiel tries to help